Hello, my name is Louise Davis and welcome to the Preach Book Club. With me I have Andy Flannagan, who is the author of the book Those Who Show Up. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Louise.
So in the book you mention how you used to lead monthly services and prayer meetings in St Mary's Undercroft, which is a chapel in Parliament. Can you explain how that relationship came about?
Gosh, to be honest, I really kind of stumbled into it. I spent a lot of my student years and then the time afterwards writing a lot of angry songs about the state of the planet and about realising, why people were in poverty and the systems that were keeping them in poverty. And so that led to writing a lot of songs about global justice, which led to working with folks like Tear Fund, Christian Aid, and being taken away by those folks, to go to Bangladesh to see sweatshops, to go to Kenya to see orphanages, and then coming back and singing about that stuff, raising people's awareness about what was going on in our world. And then increasingly, as those agencies turned their attention to lobbying, to changing, trade rules or debt rules or other things that needed to change, they were communicating with politicians. So I was being asked to sing to or speak to politicians. And in the midst of that, I sort of got a real sense, and I was really genuinely surprised. In spending more time with those politicians, I realised there is no magic dust here. People are not operating in some sort of higher moral or intellectual plane. And I spotted a real opportunity for Christians to get involved, to not just be shouting from the outside, but to be getting involved on the inside. So I started spending a lot more time with a lot more MPs, started writing stuff that was political, and I was invited to help out with the worship stuff and the Bible study stuff in Parliament, just to serve into that and to serve those folks who were already Christians or who were exploring the Christian faith in the midst of it. So it was a ridiculous privilege, and it actually made sense because a few years previous I'd walked into Westminster Hall, the big hall where people went around the Queen Mother's coffin, or where Nelson Mandela or Barack Obama spoke. Walked into that room and felt like God gave me a bit of a nudge and say, one day you'll lead people in worship here in this place from these steps. And I thought, that's just my megalomania talking. That could not be true. And then it was a few years later. I was asked then to help with the worship for what was happening in the chapel, the monthly worship services. And then a little bit after that, I was asked to help with the prayer breakfast, the national prayer breakfast, to do the worship for that. And it had always been happening in the Queen Elizabeth Centre across the road from Parliament, but then it got moved in to Westminster Hall. And I thought, that's incredible. I'm actually going to be leading worship in Westminster Hall. I'm thinking, God, you're so sharp. But in Westminster Hall, the stage for the prayer breakfast was always to the right hand side of the room. I thought, well, God, you got close enough. I wasn't doing it from those steps, but I was doing it there. And then I walked into sound check at 5:30 that morning, and the whole room had rotated, and the stage was actually up at the top. And so it actually ended up happening. 650 people with hands in the air in worship in that place. So I felt like that was God giving me a nudge that you are meant to be involved here, that you are meant to be engaged. So it was actually through the music that it drew me into the kind of the full-on political stuff.
So, you're leading worship, you're having this experience of politics, but what actually motivated you to write this book?
I think seeing the number of people who were getting involved and seeing real transformation both in their localities, but also on national policy level, seeing Christians who weren't getting any news. It's not something that's going to make the news, a Christian getting involved. Good news stories don't make the news. So I wanted to tell some of their stories as I got to know these people. But also I think in the work of trying to engage people in politics, time and time again, you come up against the classic reasons why people don't want to engage. To be honest, the church can make transformation happen faster than political change. It's actually not a priority for Christians who are trying to save souls, or, it's a dirty game, or those meetings are so boring. All the classic reasons why people don't want to engage, especially, I couldn't agree with everything that party stands for. And as I was, getting schooled in political theology and a grounding in the biblical call to get involved, I was seeing that actually the biblical call to get involved supersedes a lot of our reasons and our excuses for not getting involved, and how there actually were answers to some of those questions. And as I met more people and I heard more, I started to learn how to articulate those things, and that became a bit of a narrative that we thought, well, look, we actually need to put that down in a book as a resource for people who are exploring this stuff, who have all the passion and all the commitment and passionate about community, but there's something stopping them actually getting political. And we wanted to do something that would actually remove that obstacle. And the exciting thing is it seems to have happened.
That's amazing. So tell us a few stories of what have happened as a result of people reading your book.
it's this ridiculous joy of mine to get these emails from people. So they're partly joyful, but they're partly accusatory. It's like, it's all your fault. You know, one of the things that I say in the book is that if we, I guess, understand and value the stuff that we've learned from being part of church, you know, the fact that we might be good at conflict resolution, perhaps, hopefully, that we might have learned some public speaking, we might have learned some social skills along the way, we might turn up on time for meetings, we might actually bring biscuits to meetings, you know, all the things that we learn that we undervalue, that we've probably learned from being part of a church community. Actually, when people bring that stuff to the political realm, you know, if you bring even a shred of creativity or optimism to a local political party meeting, you know, you're straight away in the top 5% of local political operatives, and people read that and don't really believe it, but then they actually try it out, and then I get the emails a few weeks later of the folks who are saying, oh my goodness, you're right, I turned up, and a month later I'm the vice chair, a month later I'm the treasurer, and I'm the chair now, or now I've been selected to be a local candidate. And so, and it's a beautiful thing to see what happens when God's people step forward, and when you still believe in the person of the Holy Spirit, and you start to see why these people shine. And you also know that actually as Christians, because of the incredible breadth of social action and community action that churches are involved in, we're actually best placed sometimes in a community to know what the big challenges are. And so for all those reasons, Christians seem to shine when they step forward. And so it is my glorious privilege to read these emails from people. And you know, time and time again, people reading stories of, you know, ridiculous favour, things that really shouldn't have happened but happened. And you start to realise that God is weaving his way through this whole thing.
Maybe a book should come with a warning, you know, read this and your life will be changed forever. I mean, you did write this book in 2015, published by Muddy Press. And I was just wondering, you know, like in the current state of politics, we're 4 years on now, you know, is there anything that you would change? Is there anything that you would add or delete? You know, is there another book in you to, you know, say, oh, this is what I think now?
I don't really understand the question, because nothing really significant has happened in politics in the last 4 years. I can't think of anything of interest or anything that might have caused, you know, chaos or controversy. But to be honest, I go back to what was written, and I think it's even more important than ever. It's more important than ever for people to hear the call to involvement, the call to be involved, not just to sort out problems, but because it's a divine call. You know, the point we go back to in the book time and time again is that, you know, that call that we know from Genesis chapter 1, where Adam and Eve are called to leadership in the midst of creation, and that stewardship they're called to, the point we go back to time and time again is that happened before the fall. You know, that politics is not just a necessary evil to constrain evil because we live in a fallen world. It is a call, it is a divine call to public leadership. And so that hasn't changed, no matter what the context. And to be honest, you could look at what's happened, whether it's, you know, with Trump or with Brexit, you could look at what's happened and say, well, possibly that's because there haven't been enough Christians doing that straddling of holding different ethnicities together, holding different demographics together, doing the conversation, doing the interaction that we know we need to do. We're calling people through Christians in politics constantly to be building relationships with those who are not like them. And when you get involved in a political party, you will be building relationships with people who aren't like you. And that's a really healthy thing in holding society together, rather than us staying, as we often do, in our own little Christian clique.
I mean, I've read the book, and it was so inspirational to me, particularly in my political journey. And one of my favourite chapters has got to be Route 66, where you take the reader on this extraordinary journey of all the biblical passages of, you know, political engagement. Now, when you give a talk about, you know, Christianity and politics, what is the single piece of information that you hope that your audience will go away with?
Well, I think the thing that seems to resonate so strongly with people is when we talk about how Jesus said, love your neighbour as yourself. It's a phrase, I don't need to convince anybody, but it's in the Bible because they know it's there. And so we say, when Jesus said, love your neighbour as yourself, we have to ask the question, you know, how do we love ourselves? How do we love ourselves in 2019 in the UK? How do we love ourselves? What do we do to look after ourselves? And, you know, the answers, once we stop and think about them, are fairly obvious. You know, we make sure we clean our teeth. We hope to have a roof over our heads. We make sure we've got a national insurance number. You know, all these kind of practical, simple things that we do to love ourselves. We try to get enough sleep, you know, sometimes. But, you know, that's how we love ourselves. So if we're called to love other people as we love ourselves, then we can't just care about what they believe. We've got to care about the practical circumstances that they exist in. And so, you know, my actual neighbour, Frank, in London, you know, I had to care not just about what he believed. I had to care about, you know, whether he could get down the stairs, whether the lift's working or not, whether there's a reliable bus system to allow him to actually get to his doctor's appointment, whether there's enough GPs there so he can get an appointment, you know, without having to wait for 3 weeks, whether there's a hospital down the road that can actually do his knee replacement that he needs, whether there's a police service to cope with the youths who are like knocking on his door and pestering him all the time. You know, to love him, I have to care about those things. To just love him in a vacuum doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think more often than not, when people stop and think about what it means to love their neighbour, then they actually think, oh right, actually that starts to make sense. Because people will say to me, you know, I'm not into politics. And I'll ask them, well, but are you into people?
Great question.
And if you're into people, you have to be into politics. You cannot love people in a vacuum.
So, you know, this is our book for the Preach Book Club, you know, and, you know, we're going to be reading it this month. What is your prayer for the readers after they finish this book? What is it that you want us to do as a result of reading Those Who Show Up?
Well, I would love people to show up. Not surprisingly, I would